Putting relations back on the right track, China makes the case for cooperation instead of confrontation with the United States. Hello, I'm Mike Walter sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. China is looking to a new leadership team at the White House to bring about a reset of relations between Beijing and Washington. Speaking at a forum on China-U.S. ties, China State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi said recent years have seen relations run into what he called the biggest difficulty since the establishment of diplomatic ties. And he outlined China's vision to improve cooperation with the United States. CGTN's Yu Yang reports from Beijing.
Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi says the communication between Chinese President Xi Jinping and the newly elected U.S. leader Joe Biden on the Chinese New Year's Eve has pointed the way for the future development of bilateral ties, as the two sides agree to enhance mutual understanding and avoid misunderstanding. Wang made the remarks at the opening of this year's Lantern Forum. The theme is promoting dialogue and cooperation and managing differences, bring China-U.S. relations back to the right track. He said for the normalization of the China-U.S. ties, mutual respect is an indispensable element.
It is important to respect each other and not to interfere in each other's internal affairs. This is a basic norm governing international relations. A good-mannered gentleman never thrusts his knife and fork into the food on someone else's plate.
The Chinese Foreign Minister also urged the U.S. side to respect China's core interests, national dignity, and rights to development.
We urge the United States to stop smearing the CPC in China's political system, stop conniving at or even supporting the erroneous words and actions of separatist forces for Taiwan independence, and stop undermining China's sovereignty and security on internal affairs concerning Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and Tibet.
Beijing believes candid dialogues would help to solve problems, and both countries would gain from cooperation and lose from confrontation.
We hope that the U.S. side will adjust its policies as soon as possible, among others remove unreasonable tariffs on Chinese goods, lift its unilateral sanctions on Chinese companies and research and educational institutes, and abandon irrational suppression of China's technological process so as to create necessary conditions for China-U.S. cooperation.
The Chinese Foreign Minister also says that China will keep upholding multilateralism while working together with the United States to promote peace and development of the international community. Yu Yang, CGTN, Beijing.
We have a lot to discuss. Let's welcome in our panelists from Beijing. Einar Tangen is a current affairs commentator, also from Beijing via Skype. Qinduo Xu is the host of CGTN's Dialogue Weekend. Here in Washington, D.C. via Skype, Harlan Ullman is the chairman of the Killowen Group, and Dan McClory is managing director and head of China for Boustead Securities. He joins us from Irvine, California. Thanks all of you for joining us. Einar, why don't I begin with you? Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi says it's time for both countries to hit the reset button. How likely is that?
Well, it's very difficult politically for Biden. The Republicans are waiting in the wings. They're looking for any kind of policy which they can claim is soft on China. Remember, China probably will be the main political issue in the midterms and also the presidential contest in 3.5 years. The Republicans know that during that time, China will become stronger and the U.S. relatively weaker. And they want to use that as a political, basically, baton to beat the Democrats at both the House, Senate, and also in the presidency.
Harlan, the way Einar just described it, it seems as though Biden's kind of boxed in with the domestic audience, but I had a chance to talk to you last week, and you're concerned about Biden's use of the word competitor, that this is kind of a slippery slope. Go over that again for us.
Well, first, this is not a Republican advantage. The only thing on Capitol Hill that Republicans and Democrats agree with is that China is the main adversary and even the main threat. And so, for better or for worse, the American public perception is that China is no longer the friend that we once thought it was, and it has become much of the basis for our national security policy. The problem with competition is that nobody has defined it. The two areas where I believe that China is most threatening to the West and to itself are in terms of pandemic, and we needed far more information from China about the causes and so forth, and climate change in the environment. And without Chinese cooperation, the damage that could be done to the environment is going to be far worse than what's happened so far in the tariff wars. I would hope at some stage the President Biden and President Xi will get together and be able to establish areas of cooperation, establish areas where there's going to be differences of opinion, and move forward in areas of cooperation. But one of the biggest problems is that to many Americans, China is the threat. I don't agree with China being a classic threat in terms of military aggression or the fact that it's building up its military, but I do think the larger issues of the pandemic and, of course, of the environment are overriding, and there has to be some agreement. If there isn't, 2022, 2023, 2024 are going to be far worse, not only for both countries, but for the region and probably the world.
Qinduo Xu, is that how you see it?
Well, I think for China, if you look at the key message from Foreign Minister Wang Yi, the message has been in line with that for President Xi Jinping and probably senior official Yang Jiechi, etc. That is, China is ready to cooperate with the United States on a series of issues, including climate change, pandemic control, and global economic recovery. Of course, China and the U.S., they have other areas of cooperation, for example, for the Iranian nuclear issue, for the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue. There's a need of a cooperation of big powers, including the U.S. and China, in order to stabilize the relationship. At the same time, I think, from the Chinese point of view, for example, like trade and investment issues, I mean, the tariffs doesn't serve the interests of the U.S. side. We know that. It serves no interests of consumers, the U.S. companies. Of course, it is not good for the Chinese side. So, probably that would be a natural progress. That is like you need to normalize some of the areas. Yes, you have a competition in the high-tech sector, for example. I partly agree. It's really hard to balance between competition and cooperation. So that is basically the message from Washington. The relationship with China is both competitive and cooperative. The thing is like, if the competition is running out of control, how can you cooperate in other sectors? So that is a challenge for Washington and also for Beijing too.
Well, Qinduo, one of the first stories that we covered when we first launched CGTN America almost a decade ago was the visit by then the Vice President Xi Jinping to Washington, where he spent a lot of time with Joe Biden. And then again, he went off to Iowa, then out to Los Angeles, met again with Biden there. And at the time, the Obama administration's approach was strategic partnership, just much what you just described. There's going to be areas where we compete, but there's going to be areas where we can cooperate. But there's been a tonal change with Biden coming in. People kind of thought maybe he'd fall back on the Obama policies, but he's definitely got a harder edge to this. Why do you think that is, and how does Beijing kind of navigate this new terrain?
It's challenging, I would say. The Biden China policy is most likely falls between that of Obama administration and the Trump administration. Some of the areas, Washington would be tough to the Chinese side. Some of the areas probably they will seek cooperation because we have to cooperate with each other. For example, on climate change, as we understand, without the Chinese participation or without U.S. participation, it's just impossible to stop the change of the climate over there, and everybody will suffer, both China and the U.S. So yes, it's a very difficult job for the senior officials from both capitals to work together. At the same time, there is a competition for Washington. They see China as upcoming major power, which is catching up quickly with the U.S. in the overall size of the economy and in the high-tech sector, etc. There's competition. To what a degree they will compete with each other. For example, the U.S. has issues with China over Taiwan, over Hong Kong, over Xinjiang. But for Taiwan, China sees it as part of its domestic affairs. It's about unification, national unification. And the U.S. support to Taiwan sometimes basically amounts to the support of independence of Taiwan. That is very difficult for Beijing to accept. Remembering Washington sees China as a threat, but also look, clearly for China, U.S. is a major threat of its national unification. And also U.S. is interfering with its internal affairs. China is not doing that, remember. China is not interfering with anything about the U.S. So I think it's really about also adjustment of perception, adjustment of the relationship between the two sides, how we see each other. Are we seeing each other on equal footing? Or the U.S. is continuing to pursue like, oh, we continue to lecture Beijing, and we continue to impose our ways of life, our ways of political system on Beijing. I think that's very important, like how we see each other here.
Dan, I can remember the Sunnyland Summit out in Palm Springs where Xi met with Obama, and then of course there was the meeting in Mar-a-Lago with Trump, and then Trump went to Beijing in 2017. But what do you think the likelihood is of these two leaders getting together, and how much ground can be covered? I mean, you're not going to take care of all the problems. Obviously, there's wide differences on some of these issues. But the two leaders coming together and actually having face-to-face talks, can that make up some of the differences?
It may for appearances, but I've got to agree with some of the things that were said earlier. The U.S.-China relationship has fundamentally been reset. And the last thing that Biden is going to do is to move in any fashion dramatically away from that. So I think in terms of keeping up appearances, and there's definitely a personal rapport between President Biden and Mr. Xi, I think that definitely takes place. But make no mistake, Minister Wang was pretty aggressive and pretty assertive in his comments, in effect lecturing the U.S. about what China will and won't do. So it wasn't the most open-handed outreach that we've seen or heard. And it also lacked any policy particulars. Statements were made, but things were not laid out in even the beginning of any certain detail about how they would be carried out. As we know, the issue that has united partisan Washington has been China and an anti-China stance. We also know that President Biden is probably going to be under even more pressure because of a pending investigation into his son, Hunter Biden, including his dealings with China. So I just think there's very little likelihood that there is going to be an opening up. And even though he has begun to populate a lot of his foreign policy and even economic policy advisors with Obama administration people, the tone is very much about this strategic competition, and it is not very conciliatory at all. Janet Yellen has gone on record as saying the tariffs are staying; they're not going anywhere. Yeah, I think we're going to have. It'll be an interesting meeting when those two leaders get together. But I think we're quite some ways from any form of a thaw or real progress.
Einar, Dan saying that it's a pretty aggressive tone from Wang Yi, but a lot of the words coming from Washington are pretty aggressive too. I mean, how do you find a way to kind of tamp down that kind of aggressive dialogue?
Well, it's very difficult. I mean, Wang Yi was responding to the situation in Washington. In essence, he was drawing lines, opening doors, and saying we should solve this by dialogue. I think that's fairly reasonable. You know, anyone can see this as, quote, aggressive, but I can't, you know, I would be hard pressed to find anybody who would say that Washington has been less than very aggressive about this whole thing. It's, you know, Biden himself came out and, you know, said this, you know, extreme challenges and things like this. You know, right now, there's this reality, which is internationally, COVID-19, not only the health aspects, but also the economic ones, denuclearization, climate change. Every issue out there that needs to be solved has to be done with cooperation. Then you have the domestic political reality, which is that everyone wants to blame China for what's gone wrong in the U.S. For instance, COVID-19. They say that the officials in Wuhan should have known immediately within a few weeks of exactly what they were dealing with in terms of a pandemic. Yet in the United States, they've had an entire year of incompetency where this is spread, and it's become a real danger to the world in the sense that new variants have popped up because they failed to suppress it when it could have been done. So, you know, this idea that it's somehow all China's fault is just a convenient way of saying that the U.S. doesn't want to take responsibility. I mean, you have what's happening down in Texas. It looks like a third world country. You have the attacks on the Capitol. how does the U.S. stand up and say, you should follow our example? This is a real issue here. So you have the U.S., which is failing to live up to its own standards, insisting that everyone else does. And this competition just isn't between the U.S. and China. Other countries are looking on, and they're beginning to wonder exactly what's going on. Why is China being criticized for 40 years of success, whereas the U.S. has failed in its own ability to move its people in the right direction?
Harlan, let me talk to you a little bit about the economic piece of this, because that's where these two countries, I mean, there's so much intertwined when it comes to the economies of both of these countries. Silicon Valley leaders back in October were hoping and optimistic that Biden would win. They were saying that the U.S. Was going to actually benefit, hopefully, if there could be a reset in terms of the tech sector, because semiconductors suppliers here in the United States were hoping to supply to Huawei. There's lots of money at stake there. What about these economic ties, and is there any pressure at all on the Biden administration to kind of maybe make some allowances for some of these companies that are suffering because of the pandemic?
Well, in fact, Mike, it's probably just the opposite. As you probably know, China has $2 or $3 trillion invested in the United States in stocks and equities. And China, of course, is looking one day to make the renminbi the central reserve currency. So there's going to be great competition there. But the issue is not economic. For example, I think that the tariff war was a catastrophe. And if I had been advising the president, that would have been one of the things I would like to talk about changing immediately. But the political atmosphere of misperception on both sides is really dangerous. And I don't know how you can turn that around, especially since the 2022 election is already playing quite heavily, even though the Biden team has only been in for a month. If you recall, in 1950, we fought a war with China and Korea. And the relations between the two countries were extremely hostile until Nixon came into power, and Henry Kissinger met with Zhou Enlai and Mao over a period of a year to begin the arrangement where there would be a rapprochement between China and the United States. The driving factor then was the Soviet Union and triangular politics. The same kind of strategic relationship does not exist in terms of pressure on China, but I do think that the climate change issues and cooperation on economics and other things could be a major factor. And so what I would think might be a way around this is if the Biden administration and the Xi administration would begin very private, very secret, covert negotiations and discussions over the next 6 months or a year to try to come up with pathways, and in the interim, try to minimize the potential for conflict and not let the relationship get out of hand. But unfortunately, from the American and Western perspective, what's happened in Hong Kong and Xinjiang and the repression of human rights, unfortunately, reminds people of what happened in Tiananmen Square in 1989, and those images are not easily forgotten, even though what our colleague in Beijing said was correct. The January 6th uprising on Capitol Hill is something that will stay in America forever, and obviously can be used to show that there's great hypocrisy on this side. But right now, relations are not good. They're headed to be worse because of mutual misperceptions, and unless someone who's imaginative and is going to use patience to try to get things back on track, as I said earlier, I do not see the prospect very good for the improvement of Sino-American relations, certainly for the short term.
Qinduo, what's your thoughts on what Harlan just said?
Well, I think, of course, we face the challenges. Everybody understands how difficult it is probably for the two countries, their relationship to be back on track. But exactly because of the challenge, we need leadership. We need courageous leadership here. We know what is right and what needs to be done by the two leadership over there. And we cannot somehow succumb to the difficulties, say, oh, it's too difficult, let's give it up, because we can't accomplish anything about that. Simply because, right now, there's too much challenge for that. I think, yes, it's a challenge for the Biden leadership. It's a challenge for Xi Jinping. But they have to do the right thing, for example, to cooperate on climate change. There's no second choice. If they don't do it, both countries will suffer from that. That would be stupid. And they have to do the right thing in order to face the history, in order to face the future generations of both nations over there. They have their differences. Everybody understands that. And somehow they have to manage the differences and talk to each other and find a way to move forward. And the cooperation cooperation will be good for the two countries, but most importantly, will be good for the whole entire world. Let's imagine if the relationship is getting worse and worse, even there's a military conflict or have a war, what would happen to the entire Asian region, Pacific region, the whole world? And the countries will be forced to choose a side. And that, there's no talk about stability or prosperity. So that would be disastrous for both nations over there. So there is an international responsibility on the shoulders of Mr. Biden and Mr. Xi Jinping. They have to do the right thing. And secondly, I would add that, yes, domestically, there is a political pressure on the Biden government, to be tough on China. To be tough is not a policy. To be tough is your attitudes. To be wise is your policy. I don't understand why, everybody is, applying pressure on the Biden team to be tough on China. Why don't the team to be wise? You have a wise China policy. The policy will be in the interest of the U.S. will also be in the interest of the entire region. Will be in the interest of China, so they can talk to each other. Even they are rivals, even their rivalries here, they can still talk to each other. Competitors can also cooperate. We have to understand that. And I think it needs courage for the Biden government to stand up to the pressure from the Republicans. They made a huge mistake. Like 500,000 Americans die, and nobody is held accountable. I think the Trump regime should be held accountable, or somebody should be accountable about that. But no, on the contrary, the Republicans is applying pressure on the current government. It's a bit weird, from my perspective, individually here.
Dan, Biden, part of his policy is to work with allies to pressure China. But given the shaky relationship between the United States and allies over the Trump years, how likely is that?
Well, I think we got a view last Friday when he addressed the Munich conference, and he really talked about the European alliance. And as we know, the China policy has been something that's united the U.S. and Europe. And as I like to say, unintentionally, President Trump served as a unifier, at least in world opinion, to align their interests, specifically Europe, versus China. So that was unintentional, but it just happened. So I think we know where Biden is going internationally. He's going to be much more of a multilateralist, far less, if at all, of a populist. So I think you're going to see him working through international organizations, and I think there'll be opportunities to work with China, who did not disengage from those international organizations, perhaps as occurred during some of the back and forth of the Trump years. So there's an opportunity to do so. But let's make no mistake. Chuck Schumer was one of the first people to tell Trump he needed to go harder on China. This isn't a Republican-Democrat issue. This is across the aisle. So I don't think Republicans are unnecessarily piling on Biden to be tough. I think he made his bed and he's decided to lie in it. And a big part of his campaign to be elected was a tough stance on China. So now it's up to him to carry that out, and he will deviate from it at his own peril, I believe.
Einar, with Obama, it was the pivot to Asia. With Trump, it was the Indo-Pacific strategy. One research fellow in China is expressing fears that Biden will try to assemble a mini NATO surrounding China. Of course, there's been this whole concern about, containment of China. It's seen as a competitor. Give me your view on that. Do you think that's likely? And again, how do we kind of ease these frustrations that both sides are showing?
Well, there's the rhetoric and the reality. There's what people say and what's actually happening. So, we've been talking a lot about the politics. Let's talk a little bit about the reality on the ground in terms of economics. FDI, foreign investment into China, is pouring in. The bond markets are full of people who are, striving to get bonds that pay 3% so that they can actually get a return on their investment versus the many trillions of dollars worldwide where you cannot. You get a negative return. China has an ongoing open market. People are investing in China. They see it as stable. Europe has to look at the U.S. and say, but for 22,000 votes in 3 states, Donald Trump could be president of the United States for the second time. So from that perspective, the reality is economics is moving in a different direction from all of this kind of politics. And that will, over time, have an effect. Money and power are rarely separated, and there's always a conjoining of them somewhere down the road. So as this goes forward, I agree, there has to be trust-building steps. The international arena is one where they have to, not want to, where they have to cooperate. But the reality on the ground, you don't ignore the economics, because you're living in this idea that it's easier to blame China than to take responsibility for what's happened yourself.
Qinduo, of course, we've seen a lot of aggressive words coming from both sides, and I'm reminded of the U.S.-China strategic and economic dialogues, where you bring all these senior officials together from both sides. They'd talk over a lot of these issues. It'd be in the capital here in the United States or the capital of China, kind of alternating. Before that, the Bush administration had a similar component. Trump administration went with this U.S.-China comprehensive economic dialogue, but that was declared dead about 4 or 5 months later. Do we need to get back to some kind of formalized steps like this, where both sides can sit down and chat? I mean, Harlan's talking about doing it in kind of a secret kind of talks, but what about something like that?
Well, that would be probably 6 months or at least a year away. It's very difficult given this political atmosphere, in particular in Washington. Anything like that will be basically attract a lot of criticism, as the previous speaker pointed out, not only from the Republican Party but also from this Democratic Party over there. But we do see the reports of this private conversation between the foreign ministry officials here and that from the State Department in Washington, for example, over nuclear issue in Iran, because I think people on the ground understands that the two sides need to cooperate with each other in order to solve that issue, to provide stability, for example, in the Middle East. China, U.S., Russia, European nations, they need to work together. So that's the reality. I hope, gradually, the two sides, they can cooperate a little by little to build some, political trust, because right now there is a lack of political trust from, the two capitals over there. They're starting with something easier, so they can build up some trust, build up some confidence, and then gradually, a couple of years later, maybe two presidents will meet each other, and then all kinds of other channels for dialogue and communication in different sectors, in different departments, probably could be formed. At least we can imagine that, because that's necessary for both sides. You talk about your common concern. You also need to talk to each other to understand the intention accurately, in order to avoid misperception or misconception from either side. Too much is at stake right now.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Qinduo Xu, all our guests. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for being with us.